Well, we already had a cost of living crisis.
And now we have a colossal cyclone cleanup bill.
The government has to work through both how we're going to pay for things and what we have to pay for.
We have some of the lowest debt levels on a per capita basis in the world.
I think we should borrow for it.
Some of the employers have been utterly devastated by these events and they're going to need support.
We have to accept that billions of dollars of additional investment is going to be required.
The Reserve Bank is tipping more price rises for food and items that will need to be replaced, like used cars and furniture.
Do not use near-term price spikes as an excuse for starting putting up the price of everything everywhere. That would be called profiteering.
Well, with me now to decipher what this disruption means for us all is business journalist Bernard Hickey. Bernard, welcome to the program. New Zealand's economy changed overnight with the cyclone, didn't it? How is that going to impact the economy for us all?
Well, the Reserve Bank is saying this could actually increase the size of the economy with all of that rebuild spending over the next couple of years. That's an extra 1% of GDP. It's also likely to increase prices. So for food, construction materials, some wages, and the Reserve Bank estimates about 0.6% over the next couple of quarters. So more growth and more inflation.
The Reserve Bank pushed ahead with its 50 basis points rate hike this week, despite the pressure already on the economy. Was that the right move?
Well, it's the sensible move if you want to retain the confidence of the markets and also just reinforce that you're really serious about inflation. They could have done two things this week. They could have actually looked at Gabrielle and thought, actually, that's an inflation shock. I need to put up interest rates even more, which would be the last thing that everyone wants. Or they could have paused completely, which is what one economist suggested. And they've decided to go with a 50 basis point hike, which is what everyone expected. They basically said, calm the farm, we're going to look through this inflation shock. But here's the key thing for the government. The Reserve Bank has said the economy is running at full tilt. We can't really add too much extra pressure. So when you're doing your Gabrielle rebuild, you need to get the money back in either tax increases or reprioritise spending elsewhere. So that's going to be a tough one. It puts the government into a corner where it's going to have to choose to cut spending elsewhere to rebuild the East Coast.
Yeah, it is a tricky balancing act. Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr has told the government this week, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he's basically said raise taxes to help with the rebuild, or I will raise interest rates.
Yeah,
so it's coming for us either way.
Exactly, and that's the problem for the government. They've got 6 months or so before the election campaign really gets underway. They've got a whole bunch of people who are going from 2% mortgages to 6% mortgages, and they've got a rebuild that they're going to have to fund by cutting spending elsewhere or putting in a tax. I think it's highly unlikely you see some sort of cyclone tax just before an election. We've already heard the opposition say this would be a flood tax and it's not necessary, you need to cut spending elsewhere. The key will be to work out how big the cost is. We've got to remember that these three areas, Northland, Rāwhiti and the Hawke's Bay, actually only represent 6% of our GDP.
Okay.
So the cost of the rebuild is going to be, at least initially, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Remember, the government has more than $100 billion in spending going on. There might be ways they can find a few coins down the back of the couch that'll pay for this.
Rob from Peter to pay Paul, and I'm sure that Grant Robertson will be turning up all of the couches in Parliament right now looking for those savings. Just I just want to come back to this idea of a tax for a second. Jacinda Ardern guaranteed no capital gains tax. That it wouldn't come under her watch. Should Chris Hipkins take another look at that? I mean, it does seem like a surefire way to lose the election, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the third rail of New Zealand politics. If he jumped on the third rail, all we'd see is him being incinerated. It's not going to happen. And that tax area is going to have to come from one of the parties deciding on the government. So Te Pāti Māori or TOP will have to be the ones forcing either National or Labour to actually address this issue. There are other ways that the government could address this. For example, this week, the Reserve Bank, as well as saying to the government, you're going to have to raise taxes, also said the banks have increased their profits in the last few months by not putting up term deposit rates. So, there is a good case for the government to look at some sort of windfall profits tax, not just on energy companies, but maybe the banks. And remember, the government supported business to the tune of $20 billion during COVID. That money went straight into bank accounts. It went out as dividends. Businesses are in a position to actually help pay for this. They have plenty of cash in the bank, and it could be something interesting for the government to have a look at, trying to get some sort of windfall tax out of businesses rather than pinging workers again.
Well, it would be certainly much more popular with those workers, wouldn't it? You've called Robertson's debt to GDP limit of 30% ludicrously low. But isn't that low debt what makes our economy resilient when we have these big shocks, for example?
Yeah, I mean, you save for a rainy day. We just had the most enormous number of rainy days.
Yeah, we have.
So that's why you spend the money. We've got a rainy day now, so we should spend it and borrow it. And you've got to remember that 30% limit, and there was a previous 20% limit, were really set in the early 2000s. Back when people who lent us money in the international markets were more nervous, they also had a lot less money. Now it's relatively easy to borrow money from international markets, and we have a great credit rating, and also everyone else around us have increased their debt. So in relative terms, we are incredibly lightly indebted, and we actually have room to borrow $60 billion and still stick within that ludicrously low limit. In my view, that limit should be closer to 60%, and that's a bigger question for the government and the opposition. Long term, how do you use the government's balance sheet to rebuild this area and make it climate resilient?
I haven't got very much time left, Bernard, but I just want to ask you quickly, this will be, basically the Finance Minister will have had to rip up his budget.
I think there will be some changes, but I'm not sure it's the complete rewrite you might have expected, let's say, after the Christchurch earthquake. Yes, those pictures are awful, and for those people in that region, it's disastrous. But when you look at it in the scale of the economy overall, just 6% of GDP in that region, and sure, there's going to be lots of spending on roads and cleanups, but it's not the sort of $40 billion shock that we saw in Christchurch, or the even larger shock we saw with COVID.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Nation this morning, Bernard Hickey.